This is the story of the world's greatest warriors, 4 of them from 4 different civilizations, who actually fought each other and whose victories and defeats changed the course of history. The European knight, the Mongol companion warrior, the Japanese samurai, and the border generals of Ming Dynasty China. 4 warrior traditions, 4 military systems, 4 answers to the same question: what does it take to be the greatest fighter in the world? By the end of this story, you will know which of them won, and you will understand why the answer is far more complicated than anyone expected. Chapter 1: Steel and Stirrups. The birth of the European knight. Rome had been the organizing principle of the Western world for centuries. At its peak, the Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents. The Mediterranean Sea was essentially a Roman lake. From Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, from Spain in the west to Syria in the east, Roman law, Roman roads, Roman armies held the whole structure together, and then it came apart. Not all at once, not in a single catastrophic moment, but slowly, expensively, exhaustingly, the political system rotted from within. Emperors were made and unmade by the armies that were supposed to protect them. The tax base shrank as the empire struggled to pay for its own defense. The borders, once impenetrable, began to leak. From the north and east came the people the Romans called barbarians. Germanic tribes with names that ring across history: the Franks, the Goths, the Vandals, the Saxons. They had been pressing against Rome's borders for generations, and as Rome weakened, they pushed harder. In the year 476, the last Roman emperor in the west was deposed by a Germanic chieftain. The western half of the empire was gone. What followed was a period that historians used to call the Dark Ages, and while that name oversimplifies a complicated reality, it captures something true about what happened to European civilization. Cities shrank. Trade collapsed. The elaborate road network that had connected the empire began to crumble without the maintenance that only a centralized state could provide. Literacy declined. The church became the primary institution holding what remained of Roman culture together. Into this fragmented world came the technology that would change everything: the stirrup. Part 1. The small device that created a warrior class. A stirrup is a simple thing: a loop of metal hanging from the saddle on each side of a horse, designed to support the rider's foot. It seems almost too simple to matter, and yet military historians have argued for decades that the stirrup was one of the most consequential inventions in the history of warfare. Here is why it mattered so much. Without stirrups, a mounted warrior faced 2 serious problems. First, keeping balance. Without a stable platform for his feet, a rider on a moving horse had to use at least one hand to grip the saddle, limiting what his other hand could do in combat. Second, and more importantly, the problem of force. When you swing a sword or drive a lance at an enemy without stirrups, the force of the impact tends to push you backward off the horse. You cannot put your full strength into a blow because your own body is not securely anchored. With stirrups, both problems disappear. The rider's feet are planted, his legs can absorb shock. His whole body becomes a weapon delivery system, braced against the stirrups, capable of driving a lance through armor, with the full momentum of a horse and rider combined. The shock cavalry charge, the defining tactic of medieval warfare, was essentially impossible without the stirrup. With it, a mounted warrior became something qualitatively different from anything that had existed before. The stirrup appears to have originated in Asia and travelled westward. By the time the Germanic tribes were establishing their kingdoms in the ruins of Western Rome, the technology was spreading through their cavalry forces, and the effects were immediate and transformative. Mounted warriors became the decisive force on the battlefield. A small number of heavily armed horsemen could defeat a much larger force of infantry. This changed the economics of military power in a fundamental way. What mattered now was not the size of your army, but the quality of your cavalry, and quality cavalry was expensive. A war horse was not an ordinary horse. It had to be large enough to carry an armoured man, trained to charge into noise and chaos without shying away, bred over generations for the specific demands of battle. Maintaining such an animal required land, feed, stabling, and the services of specialized craftsmen. The armor itself represented an enormous investment. A full set of plate armor, when it eventually reached its medieval peak, might take a skilled craftsman months to produce. The weapons, the training, the lifetime of preparation required to fight effectively on horseback, all of this demanded resources that ordinary people simply did not have. This is the economic logic that created the knight. Not nobility of spirit, not divine selection. Simple economics. The people who could afford to be effective cavalry were the people who owned land. The people who owned land became the military aristocracy, and the military aristocracy, over time, became the knights. Part 2. The system that built the knight. The political framework that formalized this economic reality was feudalism, and the kingdom that developed feudalism into its most complete form was the one that emerged from the chaos of post-Roman Western Europe to become its dominant power. The Frankish kingdom, which under Charlemagne briefly reunited much of Western Europe under a single ruler before fragmenting again after his death. Feudalism was not a planned system. Nobody sat down and designed it. It evolved organically from the practical problem of how to maintain military power in a world where central authority was weak and threats could come from any direction. The solution was a hierarchy of obligation. The king granted land to great lords. Great lords granted portions of that land to lesser lords. Lesser lords granted portions to knights. Unquote. In return, each level of the hierarchy owed military service to the level above. The knight sat near the bottom of this pyramid. He held a piece of land, called a fief, sufficient to support his horses, his armour, and his household. In exchange, he owed his lord a certain number of days of military service per year, ready to fight on horseback when called. He was not a salaried soldier. He was not a conscript. He was a landowner whose land came with a military obligation attached. This arrangement had consequences that shaped European civilization for 1,000 years. Because the knight's military value depended on his own resources and his own training, he had a degree of autonomy that soldiers in a centralized army did not. His land was his. His equipment was his. His skills were his. A king who wanted his knights' loyalty had to treat them with a certain respect, because a disgruntled knight could take his horses and his sword and go home, or worse, go to a rival. This is what made the European feudal system different from the centralized military states of ancient Rome or imperial China. Power was distributed across thousands of individual landowners, each with their own military capacity, each with their own interests to protect. The king was powerful, but he was first among equals, not an absolute ruler commanding a professional army. And out of this distributed power structure grew something unexpected: a culture, a code, an identity. Part 3. What a knight actually was. The knight was not born. He was made, through a process of training and ritual that began in childhood and lasted for more than a decade. A boy from a knightly family might be sent to the household of a great lord at the age of 7 or 8 as a page. He learned to ride, to handle weapons, to serve at table, to absorb the values and manners of the warrior aristocracy. Around the age of 14, he might become a squire, a personal attendant to a knight, accompanying him in training and eventually in battle, learning by direct observation what it meant to fight on horseback. If he survived, if he proved himself worthy, he might be knighted in his late teens or early 20s. The ceremony of knighting varied across time and place, but it typically involved some combination of ritual bathing, prayer, the donning of armour, and the accolade, a blow to the shoulder delivered by a senior knight or a lord. From that moment, he was a knight, and with that identity came a set of expectations that went beyond simple military competence. Chivalry. The word comes from the French word for horse, cheval, because the knight was defined by his horse. But chivalry as a code of conduct was about much more than riding. At its core, chivalry demanded loyalty to one's lord, courage in battle, protection of the weak, and a certain style of behaviour toward enemies of equal rank. Knights were supposed to fight other knights, not massacre peasants. They were supposed to take noble enemies prisoner rather than kill them, which was also economically rational since ransoms could be enormously valuable. They were supposed to honour their word and to seek glory rather than mere survival. How consistently knights actually lived up to this code is a question historians have argued about for centuries. The answer is inconsistently. Knights could be ferocious, brutal, and entirely without mercy when the situation seemed to call for it. The chivalric code was an ideal, aspirational rather than consistently observed, but ideals shape behaviour even when they are not perfectly followed. The existence of the code meant that knights judged themselves and each other by its standards, which created a culture with its own internal logic and its own peculiar honour. That culture produced remarkable things. The tournament circuit, where knights competed in mock combat for prizes and reputation. The literature of courtly love, where the knight's devotion to an idealised lady became a metaphor for spiritual aspiration. The Crusades, where the knight's military vocation was fused with religious purpose and aimed at the recovery of Jerusalem. The great cathedrals built by the wealth generated by the feudal system that the knights defended. And it produced, eventually, a warrior class with genuine military excellence. The heavy cavalry charge of a disciplined force of mounted knights was one of the most formidable tactical weapons of the medieval world. When it worked, it was unstoppable. A wall of armoured men and horses moving together at speed could break almost any infantry formation. When it worked, the problem with the knight as a military system was also the problem with the culture that created him. He was trained to fight as an individual. His identity was built around personal courage, personal honour, personal glory. The idea of subordinating himself to a collective tactical plan, of giving up a chance at individual distinction for the sake of coordinated group action, was alien to everything his training and his culture had taught him. This worked fine against enemies who shared the same assumptions. Against enemies who did not, it was potentially catastrophic. And in the 13th century, an enemy appeared from the east who did not share any of those assumptions at all. An enemy who had no interest in individual combat, who viewed the battlefield purely as a problem to be solved with maximum efficiency, who trained not for glory, but for victory, and who was coming west with an army the likes of which Europe had never seen. The Mongols were coming, and the knights were about to find out what happened when their system met something built on completely different principles. That story begins in the next chapter. Chapter 2. Death from the Steppe. The rise of the Mongol warrior. The knights of Europe had a word for what was coming. They did not have a good word. They did not have a word that captured the scale of it, or the speed of it, or the particular kind of terror that came with an army that fought by rules nobody in Europe had ever encountered. What they had was a name, pulled from a Latin approximation of a foreign sound, and that name was Tartars. Some chroniclers connected it to Tartarus, the deepest pit of hell in classical mythology. The implication was clear. These were not ordinary enemies. These were something that had come up from below. They were not wrong about the scale of the threat. They were completely wrong about the origin. The Mongols did not come from hell. They came from one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Great Steppe, the vast grassland that stretches from Hungary in the west to Manchuria in the east, a distance of nearly 8,000 kilometres. A landscape of extreme temperatures, scarce water, and almost no natural shelter. A place where survival required skills that no agricultural civilization could match. And a place that, for most of recorded history, the settled civilizations of Europe, China, and the Middle East had tried very hard to ignore. That was their first mistake. Part 1. The world that made the Mongol. To understand the Mongol warrior, you first have to understand the steppe, not as a romantic landscape of wind and freedom, but as a survival environment of almost unimaginable harshness. Winter temperatures on the Mongolian plateau could drop to 40 degrees below zero. Summer brought scorching heat and violent thunderstorms. Water sources were scarce and unpredictable. There was no agriculture worth mentioning. The entire economic system of steppe life was built around animals. Horses, sheep, cattle, camels. Everything depended on the health of the herd. Everything moved with the seasons, following the grass. This way of life produced a particular kind of human being. Someone who learned to ride before they learned to walk. Someone for whom the horse was not a tool or a luxury, but a necessity as fundamental as breathing. Someone who spent their entire life outdoors, in all weather, developing a physical toughness that their agricultural neighbours could barely imagine. A Mongol child could ride competently by the age of 3 or 4. By the time a Mongol boy was old enough to fight, he had spent perhaps 15 years on horseback. He could ride at full gallop across rough terrain in total darkness. He could shoot a bow accurately from the back of a moving horse, releasing the arrow in the brief moment between hoofbeats, when all 4 feet were off the ground and the platform was momentarily still. He could survive for days on minimal food, drinking mare's milk, or in extremity drinking blood from a small cut in his horse's neck. These were not military skills grafted onto a civilian life. They were the basic competencies of daily existence on the steppe. The Mongol warrior was not a professional soldier who had trained for war. He was a herdsman whose entire life had prepared him for combat, and he was organized in a way that multiplied his individual capabilities into something genuinely terrifying. Part 2. The system that built the Mongol army. Before Genghis Khan, the Mongol tribes were not an army. They were a collection of feuding clans, constantly raiding each other for livestock and slaves, occasionally forming temporary alliances that dissolved as soon as the immediate threat or opportunity passed. The steppe had never produced a unified military force because the steppe's political logic worked against unity. Every clan leader had reasons to distrust every other clan leader. Every alliance was temporary. Every peace was a preparation for the next conflict. What Genghis Khan understood, and what his rivals did not, was that this fragmentation was not inevitable. It was a choice. Here, a choice made by men who prioritized their clan's short-term advantage over the possibility of something much larger. He built something new, not an alliance of clans, but an army organized on a completely different principle. The key institution was what he called the companion system. The Mongolian word for these warriors was nökör, which means companion or friend. A man became a nökör by swearing personal loyalty not to his clan, but to his commander. In return, he received a share of the spoils of victory, protection, and the identity that came with membership in an elite fighting force. This was revolutionary. It meant that the army's loyalty ran to its commanders rather than to the clan system. A Mongol nökör who followed Genghis Khan was a Mongol warrior first, and a member of whatever clan he had been born into second. The clan ties that had kept the steppe fragmented for centuries were deliberately weakened in favour of a new military brotherhood. The organisational structure that Genghis built on top of this loyalty system was borrowed from an older steppe tradition, but applied with unprecedented rigour. Units of 10, 100, 1,000 and 10,000. Every man knew his unit. Every unit knew its function. Commands could be passed down from the top of the structure to the smallest unit with remarkable speed, because the chain was clear and every link in it had been trained to respond instantly. This combination, individually exceptional warriors organised into a disciplined collective structure, was something that neither European nor Chinese nor Islamic armies of the period had encountered before, and it fought in a way that none of them were prepared for. Part 3. How the Mongols actually fought. The Mongol way of war was built around a single insight that their enemies kept failing to grasp until it was too late. The purpose of battle is not to prove your courage. The purpose of battle is to win. And winning means destroying the enemy's capacity to resist by whatever means are most effective. The Mongol cavalry operated primarily with composite bows. These were not simple wooden bows. They were sophisticated weapons built from layers of wood, bone, and sinew, glued together under pressure, capable of generating far more power than their relatively small size suggested. A Mongol composite bow could drive an arrow through armour at distances that shocked their opponents. And Mongol warriors trained with these weapons from childhood, developing the muscle memory and the technique to use them accurately at speed on horseback. The standard Mongol cavalry tactic was the feigned retreat. A force of Mongol light cavalry would advance toward an enemy formation, release several volleys of arrows at long range, and then wheel and gallop away, as if fleeing in panic. If the enemy commander was experienced and disciplined, he would hold his formation and not pursue. But if he gave in to the temptation to chase what looked like a broken enemy, his formation would dissolve into a pursuing mob, and the pursuing mob would ride straight into a trap. Because the retreating Mongol cavalry was not fleeing, it was leading. Behind them, positioned out of sight, were heavier Mongol cavalry units, waiting for exactly this moment. The pursuing enemy formation, spread out and disorganized by the chase, would suddenly find itself facing a fresh force attacking from the front, while the supposedly fleeing cavalry wheeled and attacked from behind and the flanks. The result was encirclement. And encirclement, for the Mongols, meant annihilation. They also used psychological warfare with deliberate sophistication. Before a campaign, Mongol agents would spread stories of what happened to cities that resisted. The stories were accurate. Cities that fought back were destroyed completely. Cities that surrendered immediately were generally spared. The choice was made explicit in advance. The result was that many enemies surrendered without fighting, calculating correctly that resistance was hopeless. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was efficiency. An enemy that surrenders without battle costs nothing to defeat and provides resources that can be used in the next campaign. They were masters of logistics in a way that their agricultural opponents were not. A Mongol army on campaign was largely self-sufficient, because every soldier brought his own horses, typically 3 or more per man, rotating them to keep them fresh. They carried concentrated food rations, dried meat and milk curds that were lightweight and required no cooking. They could move at speeds that left their opponents gasping, covering distances in days that an army dependent on supply wagons would need weeks to travel, and they gathered intelligence systematically. Before any major campaign, Mongol agents moved through the target territory, mapping roads, identifying fortifications, locating sources of food and water, and most importantly, identifying political divisions among the enemy that could be exploited. The Mongols rarely attacked a target they did not understand thoroughly in advance. Part 4. The Man Who Built the Machine. Temujin was born into a minor Mongol clan around the year 1162. His father was a small-time chieftain who was poisoned by enemies when Temujin was still a child. The family was abandoned by their clan and spent years in desperate poverty on the steppe, surviving on whatever they could find. The story of how this boy grew into Genghis Khan is one of the great narratives of human history. It involved capture, enslavement, escape, the slow accumulation of allies, defeat, recovery, and eventually a military and political genius that remade the world. By the year 1206, he had done what no one before him had managed. He had united the Mongol tribes under a single authority. At a great assembly of clan leaders on the banks of the Onon River, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler. He was perhaps 40 years old. He would spend the rest of his life in almost continuous warfare, and he would win almost every battle he ever fought. What made him extraordinary was not just military talent, though that was genuine. It was his ability to build institutions that outlasted individual battles, the decimal military structure, the companion loyalty system, the meritocratic promotion system that advanced men based on performance rather than birth, the intelligence apparatus that preceded every campaign, the legal code that regulated life within the empire. These were the creations of a mind that thought not just about how to win today's battle, but about how to create a system that would keep winning after he was gone. And it worked. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his successors inherited not just a conquering army, but a functioning military system. The campaigns continued. The empire expanded. Within 50 years of his death, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the doorstep of Central Europe. It was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. And the warriors who built it were the Nukhur, the companions, the men of the steppe who had traded their clan identities for membership in something unprecedented. Those warriors were about to ride west, into a world of knights and castles and crusading armies that believed, with complete sincerity, that they were the finest soldiers on earth. They were about to be corrected. Chapter 3. When the Sky Darkened, Mongols against the Knights of Europe. In the spring of 1241, a Polish duke named Henry the Pious assembled the finest army he could gather and marched to meet the Mongol force that had just finished burning his cities. Henry was not a coward. He was not a fool. He was a capable ruler who understood that something catastrophic was happening to his world, and who chose to ride toward it, rather than away from it. He had knights from Poland, from the crusading orders of the Templars and the Hospitallers, from the German mining communities of Silesia. He had infantry, he had cavalry, and, by the standards of his time and place, it was a formidable force. The battle that followed, at a place called Legnica, lasted less than a morning. When it was over, Henry was dead. His army was destroyed. And the Mongol commander, a general named Baidar, reportedly filled 9 large sacks with the right ears of the fallen, one ear cut from each corpse as a tally of the dead. The sacks were sent east as a report to the Great Khan. On the same day, or within a day or two, another Mongol force under a general named Batu and his brilliant tactical commander Subutai met the main Hungarian army at a river called the Mohi. The Hungarian King Bela IV had assembled perhaps 60,000 men, one of the largest military forces in Central European history. The Mongols had perhaps 40,000. By the end of the Battle of Mohi, the Hungarian army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Bela himself barely escaped with his life. fleeing on horseback while Mongol riders pursued him across Hungary and into the Adriatic coast. Europe lay open. Nothing stood between the Mongol army and the Atlantic. And then the Mongols stopped, turned around, and went home. Why they stopped is one of the great questions of medieval history. The answer changes everything about how we understand what happened in those terrifying months of 1241. Part 1. The Road to Legnica. The Mongol Western campaign did not begin in 1241. It began years earlier, with the kind of systematic preparation that was the hallmark of Mongol military planning. Subutai, the greatest of Genghis Khan's generals and the architect of the Western campaign, had actually conducted a reconnaissance in force through Russia, the Caucasus, and the Western Steppe nearly 20 years before the main invasion. He had fought and defeated Russian princes, Georgian armies, and Cuman nomads on that earlier expedition, gathering intelligence about the political landscape of Eastern Europe that would prove invaluable when the time came for the real campaign. When the full Western campaign launched in 1237, under the nominal command of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, and the actual operational command of Subutai, the Mongols knew exactly what they were walking into. They knew about the political divisions among the Russian princes. They knew which cities were fortified and which were not. They knew the road networks, the river crossings, the seasonal patterns of the steppe that determined when the ground would be frozen hard enough to support rapid cavalry movement. They hit Russia first, in the winter of 1237 to 1238, moving across frozen rivers that became highways for their cavalry. They destroyed the major cities of northeastern Russia one by one: Vladimir, Suzdal, Ryazan. Each city that resisted was taken and burned. The populations were killed or enslaved. The Russian princes, unable to coordinate a unified defense because of their own political rivalries, were defeated piecemeal. The speed of the Mongol advance was simply beyond anything Russian commanders had experienced or prepared for. By 1240, after a brief pause on the steppe to rest and regroup, the campaign resumed. Kiev, the greatest city in all of Russia, fell in December. An eyewitness account written shortly afterward described a landscape of bones and silence where one of the most magnificent cities in Eastern Europe had stood. Then the army divided. One force under Baidar moved into Poland. Another under Batu and Subutai moved into Hungary. The division was not a weakness. It was a deliberate strategy designed to prevent the European kingdoms from concentrating their forces. Part 2. What happened at Legnica and Mohi? Duke Henry of Silesia had been trying to coordinate a response to the Mongol invasion. He sent messengers to the Bohemian king, Wenceslas, who was marching to join him with a large army. If the two forces could unite, they would have a genuinely formidable combined army. The Mongols knew this. Baidar moved specifically to prevent the junction, pushing his force between Henry and the approaching Bohemians, forcing Henry to give battle before his reinforcements arrived. At Legnica, Henry deployed his forces in the manner that European military doctrine of the period recommended. Heavy cavalry knights in the centre and on the flanks, infantry supporting. His plan was the standard plan. Hold the centre, use the knights to deliver a decisive charge, and break the enemy. The Mongols had no intention of receiving that charge. Their light cavalry skirmished forward, loosing arrows at long range, then retreated. Some Polish accounts mention that the Mongols used some kind of smoke or noxious substance to confuse the defenders, possibly a primitive form of smokescreen. Whether this is accurate or an attempt to explain the inexplicable, the effect was that the Polish formation lost cohesion while pursuing what looked like a retreating enemy. When the pursuing knights were sufficiently disordered and separated from their supporting infantry, the heavier Mongol cavalry came in from the flanks. The encirclement was complete. Henry died in the fighting, his head displayed on a lance as the Mongol force moved on. At Mohi, the situation was even more dramatic. King Bela had positioned his Hungarian army in a fortified camp on the western bank of the Sajo River, with the main crossing point guarded. His position seemed secure. The Mongols could not cross without taking heavy losses at the bridge. Subutai did not try to cross at the bridge. While Batu launched a frontal assault on the crossing that pinned the Hungarian attention and defence, Subutai took a substantial force on a wide flanking march, found or constructed a secondary crossing several kilometres downstream, and crossed in darkness. By dawn, the Hungarian camp was surrounded on three sides. The Battle of Mohi became a massacre. The Hungarians who tried to fight back were killed. but Subutai deliberately left one side of the encirclement open, a gap that appeared to offer an escape route. It was a trap. The fleeing Hungarians were pursued for days across the Hungarian plain, cut down by Mongol cavalry who killed with the methodical efficiency of hunters driving prey. The technique had a name in Mongol tactical doctrine. It was called the tulugma, the standard sweep. Leave an apparent escape route, pursue the fleeing enemy into open ground where your cavalry superiority is decisive, and destroy them at leisure. It was more effective than a complete encirclement, because a surrounded enemy with no hope of escape will sometimes fight with the ferocity of desperation. An enemy who believes he is running to safety will not turn to fight. Part 3. Why the Knights Failed. The military analysis of what happened at Legnica and Mohi is not complicated. The European knights were defeated because their tactical system was designed for a different kind of opponent. The knights' great weapon was the charge. A formed mass of heavy cavalry, moving at speed, could break almost any formation that stood and received it. The key word is stood. The knights' tactical system assumed an enemy that would stand and fight in a relatively compact formation, because that was how European armies fought each other. The Mongols would not stand. They would not be where the charge expected them to be. They would absorb the charge by simply not being in its path, letting the knights ride into empty air, and then attack the disordered, winded cavalry from multiple directions before they could reform. The other critical failure was coordination. A European army of the period was not really an army in the modern sense. It was a collection of individual warriors, each with his own honour to defend and his own glory to seek. The idea of a coordinated tactical plan, where some units sacrificed advantageous positions for the sake of the whole, was alien to the culture of knighthood. When the Mongols appeared to retreat, the knights charged because that was what you did when the enemy retreated. You pursued. You achieved personal glory. And, quote, you did not stop and ask whether the retreat might be a trap. Against an enemy that used the feigned retreat as its primary tactical weapon, this instinct was fatal. There is no shame in acknowledging this. The Mongol military system was genuinely superior for the kind of warfare they practiced. It was more flexible, faster, more disciplined, and more intelligently commanded than anything the European kingdoms had developed. The knights were not cowards. They were not incompetent. They were trained for one kind of war and encountered another. Part 4. The Great Mystery, Why Did They Stop? In the spring of 1242, with Hungary devastated and nothing significant standing between the Mongol army and Western Europe, Batu Khan received news from the east. Ugadai Khan, son of Genghis and the supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire, had died. By Mongol law and custom, the great nobles and military commanders were required to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai, the great assembly that would choose a new Khan. Batu turned his army around and marched east. He never returned to Western Europe. This is the explanation that most historical accounts give for why the Mongols stopped, and it is certainly part of the truth. 2. The death of a great Khan was a genuine political crisis that required the presence of the senior Mongol leaders. But there are historians who argue that this explanation is incomplete, that if Batu and Subutai had truly wanted to continue the Western campaign, they would have found a way to do so. That the Kurultai provided a convenient political reason to stop a campaign that was encountering increasing difficulties. Those difficulties were real. The further west the Mongol army moved, the longer its supply lines stretched. The terrain of Central Europe, with its forests and fortified cities, was less favourable for the kind of sweeping cavalry operations that had worked so well on the Russian steppe. The European kingdoms west of Hungary were beginning to understand what they were facing and starting to coordinate their defences. The Mongols had taken enormous losses in the Russian campaign, losses that had not yet been replaced. And there was another factor. The Mongol Empire by 1242 was vast, beyond any previous human experience. Administering it was a challenge that consumed enormous resources. Extending it further into Western Europe would require a permanent military presence and ongoing campaigns against enemies who would never stop resisting. The cost-benefit calculation was not obviously favourable. Perhaps the Mongols stopped because their great Khan died and they had to go home. Perhaps they stopped because the campaign was becoming too expensive. Perhaps both things were true simultaneously. History rarely has single causes. What is certain is that Western Europe survived, not because it defeated the Mongols, it did not. At Legnica and Mohi, the Mongols won completely. Western Europe survived because the Mongols chose not to continue. That is a very different thing from a military victory, and the distinction matters, because on the other side of the world, another military tradition was about to face the same Mongol war machine, and the outcome there would be different in ways that nobody fully predicted. Not because the Mongols were weaker, but because the sea and the wind and the particular stubbornness of Japanese warriors would combine to produce a result that changed the history of East Asia. That story comes next. Chapter 4. Sea, Wind and Steel. The Mongols meet the samurai. Kublai Khan had a problem that his grandfather never had to solve. Genghis Khan had conquered everything he wanted on land. The Great Steppe, the cities of Central Asia, the kingdoms of China's north, the Islamic world from Persia to the edge of Egypt. All of it fell to cavalry. All of it fell to the tactics that the Mongol military machine had refined over decades of continuous warfare. Land was something Mongols understood. Land was home. Water was different. Kublai Khan, ruling from his magnificent capital at Khanbalik, the city that would later be called Beijing, had completed the conquest of southern China by 1279. He now controlled the most populous and wealthiest civilization on Earth. He had access to Chinese shipbuilding technology, Chinese naval expertise, Chinese administrative sophistication. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most powerful ruler in the world, and he wanted Japan. The island nation had refused his letters, had executed his ambassadors in some accounts, a deliberate and calculated insult, had made clear that it had no intention of becoming a tributary state of the Mongol Empire. From Kublai's perspective, this was simply not acceptable. Every corner of the known world was submitting to Mongol authority. A collection of islands off the coast of China was going to be no different. He was wrong, but it would take 2 attempts and the deaths of tens of thousands of men before that became undeniable. Part 1. The Warriors Who Waited. While Kublai Khan was preparing his fleets, the warriors who would meet them were living in a world built entirely around a different kind of war. The Japanese samurai of the 13th century had spent the previous century fighting each other. The Genpei War, the great conflict between the Taira and Minamoto clans, had ended in 1185 with the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate. Since then, Japan had experienced relative stability. But stability for the samurai did not mean peace. It meant tournaments, disputes over land, occasional small conflicts between rival clans, and above all, the constant cultivation of individual martial skills. The samurai's entire military identity was built around the individual. He trained from childhood with bow and sword. He memorized his genealogy so that he could recite it on the battlefield when challenging a worthy opponent. He wore armor that was as much a statement of identity as a practical protection, decorated with his clan's colors, personalized in ways that made him recognizable. He sought personal glory in combat, the opportunity to kill a famous opponent or perform a deed of exceptional courage that would be remembered and rewarded. This was not naivety. Within the context of Japanese warfare as the samurai understood it, this individual focus made perfect sense. Japanese battles of the period were largely affairs between warrior clans who shared the same assumptions about how fighting worked. Both sides understood the ritual challenges, the individual duels, the careful accounting of deeds performed and rewards owed. The system had internal coherence. What it had never encountered was an enemy that simply did not operate within that system at all. Part 2. The First Wave. The first Mongol invasion force landed at Hakata Bay in northern Kyushu in the autumn of 1274. The fleet carried somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 warriors, drawn from Mongol cavalry, Korean infantry, and northern Chinese soldiers who had been conscripted into Kublai's armies after the conquest of the Jin dynasty. The Japanese forces that met them on the beach were prepared for Japanese warfare. They were not prepared for what the Mongols brought. The first shock was the arrows. Mongol composite bows outranged Japanese longbows significantly. Japanese warriors advancing toward the Mongol lines were being hit before they could effectively return fire. The second shock was the noise. Mongol forces used drums and signal horns to coordinate their movements, and they also deployed explosive projectiles, iron bombs filled with gunpowder that burst on impact with a sound and a flash that Japanese warriors had never encountered. The horses shied. The men flinched. The psychological effect was significant. The third and most fundamental shock was the tactics. When a samurai rode forward to announce his name and lineage, and challenge a worthy opponent to individual combat, the Mongol formation simply ignored him and shot him. There was no ritual, there was no acknowledgement, there was just an arrow, or several arrows, and then the advance continued. The Japanese accounts of the first day of fighting describe something close to bewilderment, not just military difficulty, but a kind of conceptual disorientation. The enemy was not fighting correctly. The enemy was not fighting the way war was supposed to work, and in that gap between expectation and reality, the Japanese defensive line buckled. By the end of the first day, the Japanese had been pushed back from the beaches. By nightfall, the situation was serious enough that the commander of the Japanese forces was considering a retreat inland to regroup and request reinforcements. And then the Mongol force did something that surprised everyone. It pulled back to the ships. The reasons for this withdrawal are still debated. The most likely explanation is that the Mongol commanders, operating far from their supply base and uncertain about Japanese strength further inland, decided that the security of the fleet was the priority. They would rest, resupply from the ships, and resume the assault in the morning. What happened during the night was not in anyone's plan. A storm struck Hakata Bay. It was not a typhoon, not the catastrophic seasonal storm that would play a role in the second invasion. It was a serious storm, enough to damage and sink a significant number of ships, enough to create supply problems and casualties among the forces aboard. And the Mongol commanders, facing an uncertain military situation on land and now a damaged fleet beneath them, made the decision to withdraw. The first invasion was over. Japan had survived. But the Japanese commanders who reviewed what had happened understood clearly that their warriors had not, in any honest assessment, beaten the Mongol military system. They had survived because of weather, and because the Mongols had chosen to withdraw. That was a very different thing from a victory. The question was what to do with the time they had been given. Part 3. 7 years of preparation. The Kamakura shogunate responded to the first invasion with a seriousness that reflected a clear-eyed understanding of the threat. This was not an ordinary enemy. The normal approach to Japanese warfare would not be sufficient. Something had to change. The most visible change was the construction of a stone defensive wall along the shoreline of Hakata Bay. Running for roughly 20 kilometers, it was not a massive fortification by continental standards, but it served specific tactical purposes. It would slow any amphibious landing, give defending archers a stable, elevated firing platform, and most importantly, prevent the kind of rapid inland advance that the Mongols had achieved in the first invasion. The wall was built with the practical military intelligence of people who had analysed exactly what had gone wrong and were trying to fix it. Less visible, but equally important, was the change in how Japanese warriors began thinking about the fight ahead. The individual focus of samurai warfare did not disappear, but commanders began thinking more carefully about how to use terrain, how to coordinate multiple units, how to get their warriors into the kind of close combat where individual fighting skill would matter more than massed arrow fire. They also built ships, small, fast vessels designed not for transport but for fighting, for night raids against an anchored fleet, for getting Japanese warriors onto Mongol ships where the confined spaces would neutralize the Mongols' coordination advantages and where a samurai with a sword was genuinely dangerous. 7 years of preparation. And then in the summer of 1281, Kublai Khan sent his second fleet. Part 4. The Second Wave and the Divine Wind. The scale of the second invasion dwarfed the first. 2 separate fleets, one from Korea and one from the ports of southern China, carrying a combined force that contemporary sources estimated at anywhere from 100,000 to 150,000 men. Even if these numbers are significantly inflated, as medieval military numbers almost always are, the force was enormous by any standard. It was one of the largest amphibious operations in the history of the medieval world. The Korean fleet arrived first and attempted to land at Hakata Bay. The stone wall was waiting. The wall worked exactly as intended. Mongol troops who made it ashore found themselves pinned against the shoreline, unable to push rapidly inland, fighting along a defensive position that gave the Japanese archers a significant advantage. The rapid breakthrough that had characterized the first invasion did not happen, and then the Japanese raiding vessels came out at night. The raids became one of the defining features of the second invasion. Small groups of Japanese warriors, typically between 10 and 30 men, paddled out to the anchored Mongol ships in darkness. They climbed the hulls. They fought on the decks in exactly the close-quarters combat that samurai training had prepared them for. A Mongol soldier in the cramped space of a ship's deck, unable to maneuver, unable to use coordinated unit tactics, was fighting a samurai on the samurai's terms. The results were different from the open beach fighting of the first invasion. The raids caused losses that went beyond the physical. Mongol crews could not sleep without fear of attack. Commanders planning the next day's assault had to worry about the security of the ships they were sleeping on. The psychological pressure of the raids was relentless. The two fleets were supposed to rendezvous and combine before launching the main assault. The southern fleet was delayed by logistical problems and by the unexpectedly fierce resistance at Hakata Bay. Weeks passed. The combined fleet sat at anchor or in nearby waters, taking casualties from raids, unable to advance decisively, waiting for the assault that would require full coordination between both forces. When the southern fleet finally arrived and the combined force prepared for a major push, it was already the height of summer. The waters around Kyushu in late summer are among the most dangerous in the world. The warm western Pacific generates typhoons with a regularity that experienced sailors know to fear. In late August of 1281, a typhoon struck, 2 days of storm. When it was over, the Mongol fleet had been effectively destroyed. The estimates of losses vary enormously, but most sources suggest that somewhere between half and 2/3 of the combined fleet was sunk or wrecked. Tens of thousands of soldiers drowned. Those who made it to shore were hunted down by Japanese warriors in the days that followed. Kublai Khan's second invasion of Japan was finished. Part 5. What actually decided the outcome? The Japanese called the typhoon kamikaze, the divine wind, sent by the gods to protect their sacred islands from foreign conquest. The name became one of the most powerful myths in Japanese history, invoked 7 centuries later when Japanese pilots flew their aircraft into American warships in the final desperate year of the Second World War. But here is the question that the myth obscures. What actually decided the outcome of the Mongol invasions of Japan? The typhoon was real. Its destruction of the Mongol fleet was decisive. Without it, the second invasion would very likely have succeeded. The combined Mongol force, once fully assembled and coordinated, probably had the military capacity to overwhelm Japanese resistance. The stone wall was valuable but not impenetrable. The night raids were effective but could not indefinitely prevent a determined assault by a force of that size. So the typhoon mattered. It mattered enormously, but the typhoon alone does not explain everything. The stone wall slowed the first landing and prevented the rapid breakthrough that had worked in 1274. The 7 years of preparation had produced real military improvements. The night raids had been genuinely effective, disrupting Mongol planning and inflicting losses that weakened the assault force before the storm arrived. The Japanese had not simply waited for divine intervention. They had fought, they had adapted, they had taken the lessons of the first invasion and applied them with intelligence and determination. When the typhoon came, it destroyed a Mongol fleet that was already struggling, already behind schedule, already dealing with supply problems and combat losses it had not anticipated. The divine wind finished a job that human courage and preparation had begun. And there was one more factor that the myth of the kamikaze completely ignores. The Mongol military system, so devastatingly effective on the open steppe and the plains of Eastern Europe, had genuine limitations when it came to amphibious warfare against a defended coastline. The horses that were the foundation of Mongol military power were difficult to transport and nearly useless on the decks of ships. The coordinated unit tactics that had broken European knights at Legnica and Mohi were much harder to execute when your units were fragmented across hundreds of ships, and the enemy was attacking you in the dark from small boats. The Mongols were not invincible. They were a cavalry power, attempting a naval operation that played to their weaknesses rather than their strengths. Japan was the wrong target for the wrong army. That does not diminish what the Japanese warriors accomplished. Against a genuine military threat of terrifying scale, they held, they adapted. 2. They fought in ways that their tradition had not prepared them for, and found ways to make their strengths count even against an enemy who refused to play by their rules. The samurai were remarkable warriors. The Mongol invasions proved it. Not because Japan won in any simple sense, but because Japan survived when survival was genuinely in doubt. Now, on the other side of the world, another military tradition was developing that would eventually put the samurai to their next great test. Not Mongols from the steppe, but soldiers from the Ming Dynasty of China, whose border generals had spent generations fighting some of the most brutal frontier warfare in the world. Their story begins next. Chapter 5. Iron Families, the Border Generals of Ming Dynasty China. There is a type of soldier that history tends to forget. Not the emperor who ordered the wars, not the famous general whose name appears in the history books, not the philosopher who wrote about military strategy from the comfort of a palace study, but the men who actually lived on the frontier, who were born on the frontier, who grew up watching their fathers fight and buried their brothers in the border soil, and sent their own sons out to do the same thing in the same places against the same enemies. The Ming dynasty called them Jianmen, the military families of the frontier, the border generals and their households, and for 200 years they were the reason the northern border of China held. Their story is not a story of individual heroes, it is a story of families. Entire lineages dedicated to war across multiple generations, passing down not just surnames but tactical knowledge, hard-won understanding of specific terrain, networks of loyalty among soldiers who had served together for decades, a father's battlefield experience becoming a son's inherited wisdom, a grandfather's lessons in ambush and pursuit becoming a grandson's instinct. This was a different kind of military tradition from the European knight's individual honour or the samurai's personal glory. This was something more collective, more durable, too, and in some ways more ruthless in its efficiency. Part 1. The world that made the border general. To understand the Ming border generals, you first need to understand what they were defending against. And what they were defending against was the memory of the worst thing that had ever happened to China. The Mongols. In 1279, Kublai Khan completed the conquest of the Song dynasty and became the ruler of all China. For the first time in history, the entire Chinese landmass was under foreign rule. The Yuan dynasty, as the Mongols called their Chinese empire, lasted less than a century. In 1368, a peasant rebel leader named Zhu Yuanzhang drove the Mongols back to the steppe and founded the Ming dynasty. He became the Hongwu emperor, and he spent the rest of his reign trying to make sure that what had happened to China under the Mongols could never happen again. The solution he chose was the Weisuo system, a military organization built around hereditary military households. Soldiers would not be conscripted from the civilian population and then released back to civilian life. Instead, specific families would be designated as military families, their sons inheriting the obligation to serve, generation after generation. These military households were settled in garrison communities called Weisuo along the borders and in strategic locations throughout the empire. They were given land to farm, reducing the cost to the state of maintaining them, and they were expected to be self-sufficient soldiers available at need. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it had a fatal flaw that would not become fully apparent for generations. The Weisuo system worked well when the military families were actually fighting. When the frontier was active, when battles were being fought and skills were being tested and the best men were rising to command, the system produced genuine warriors. But in periods of relative peace, when the farming was more important than the fighting, the military edge dulled. Skills that were not used were not maintained. The hereditary principle meant that sons inherited their father's military ranks regardless of whether they had inherited their father's military abilities. By the mid-Ming period, the regular Weisuo forces were largely useless as a fighting force. Corrupt officers had converted their soldiers into private labourers. Military land had been seized by powerful landowners. The rolls listed soldiers who did not exist and collected their pay. When actual fighting was required, the Weisuo troops were frequently more dangerous to their own side than to the enemy. Out of this failure grew something better and something more dangerous. Part 2. The Family Army. When the regular military failed, Ming commanders did what practical men have always done when institutions let them down. They built something outside the institution. The jiading system. Private soldiers. Family retainers. Men recruited personally by a commander. Paid from his own resources. Loyal to him, rather than to the abstract authority of the state. Not very different, in their basic logic, from the retainers of a European feudal lord or the landan of a Japanese warrior clan. These private soldiers were called jiading, household troops, or more specifically jading, family retainers. The best commanders invested heavily in them. They selected for quality rather than accepting whoever the hereditary roles provided. They paid well, attracting men who actually wanted to fight rather than men who had inherited a military obligation they resented. They trained their jihading personally, developing the kind of mutual understanding between a commander and his troops that only comes from years of shared experience. The result was a two-tier military system. The official Weizuo troops existed on paper, collected their pay, and were largely ignored in actual combat planning. The jihading were the real fighting force, small in number but genuinely effective, loyal to their commander with a personal intensity that conscripted soldiers could not match. And because the commanders who built these household forces were themselves from military families, the jihading system became hereditary in practice, if not in law. A great commander's son would inherit not just his father's official rank, but his father's household troops, his father's network of loyal subordinates, his father's understanding of the specific frontier terrain where the family had fought for generations. The border general families became the real military power on the Ming frontier. The most famous of these families was the Li family of Liaodong. Li Chengliang served as the supreme commander of the Liaodong frontier for decades. His household troops were legendary, not just in number, but in quality. He recruited the best fighters he could find, regardless of their origin. Han Chinese, Jurchen tribesmen, men from a dozen different ethnic backgrounds who were willing to fight under his banner. He paid them well and demanded absolute loyalty in return. And he delivered victories, battle after battle against the Mongol and Jurchen forces pressing against the northern frontier. His sons followed him into command, his grandsons after them. The Li family name became synonymous with military effectiveness on the Liaodong frontier in the way that certain families in medieval Europe became synonymous with military excellence in specific regions. This was institutional knowledge made flesh, the accumulated wisdom of generations of frontier fighting, passed down not in books but in practice, in the daily life of men who had grown up watching and learning and eventually doing. Part 3. How the border generals actually fought. The fighting on the Ming northern frontier was nothing like the ritualized combat of the early samurai or the chivalric tournaments of European knights. It was grinding, practical, often brutal warfare against enemies who knew the terrain as well as the defenders did, and who could appear and disappear with a speed that conventional military responses could not match. The Mongol successor states that pressed against the northern border after the fall of the Yuan dynasty were not the unified empire of Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan. They were fragmented, often fighting each other as much as they fought the Ming, but they retained the fundamental Mongol military capabilities that had made their ancestors so formidable. They were superb cavalry. They were fast. They were difficult to pin down and bring to decisive battle, and they knew exactly where the Ming defences were strong and where they were weak. The border generals developed a fighting style calibrated to this specific threat. Not the grand set-piece battles of European warfare or the individual duels of samurai combat, but a fluid, intelligence-driven approach to frontier defence that combined fortification, ambush, pursuit, and the selective application of overwhelming force at chosen points. Intelligence was everything. A border general who did not know where the enemy was, how many they were, and what they intended was a border general who was going to lose men and territory. The successful commanders built extensive networks of scouts and informants, men who lived on both sides of the frontier, and could provide advance warning of Mongol movements. Li Chengliang was famous for the quality of his intelligence network. He rarely fought a battle he had not prepared for. When fighting was required, the border generals preferred to choose the ground. An ambush in terrain that neutralized Mongol cavalry advantages, a defensive position that funneled attackers into killing grounds covered by firearms and crossbows, a pursuit operation after a successful defense that turned a repelled raid into a genuine defeat. They were not passive defenders. The best of them understood that a frontier can only be held by periodic, offensive action that makes the cost of raiding too high to be worth paying. The jihading household troops were the instrument of this approach. Small, elite, flexible, and absolutely loyal to their commander. They could move fast enough to respond to raids, fight effectively in the mixed terrain of the northern frontier, and execute the kind of complex operations that required genuine trust between soldiers and commanders. Firearms played an increasingly important role as the Ming period progressed. The Ming military was among the first in the world to systematically incorporate gunpowder weapons into its tactical doctrine. By the mid-Ming period, a well-equipped border force would include significant numbers of soldiers armed with firearms alongside traditional cavalry and infantry. The combination of mobile cavalry response capability and the firepower of musketeers gave the border forces a tactical flexibility that pure cavalry opponents struggled to counter. Part 4. The code that held them together. What made a Jiading soldier fight? What made him willing to die for his commander when the regular Weisuo troops were quietly farming or collecting pay for service they never rendered? The answer is not simple, and it is not the same as the answers you would get from a European knight or a Japanese samurai. The knight fought for honor, for God, for his lord, and for the personal glory that would make his name remembered. The samurai fought for honor, for his clan, for the martial ideal that defined his identity. Both had elaborate codes that articulated what they were supposed to be and how they were supposed to behave. The Jiading fought for something more immediate and more personal. They fought for their commander, for the man who had recruited them, who paid them, who trained alongside them, who shared their hardships and rewarded their courage and remembered their names. The relationship between a great border general and his household troops was one of the most intense forms of personal loyalty that the Chinese military tradition produced. This loyalty was not unconditional. It was earned and maintained through the commander's performance. A border general who failed his men, who threw their lives away carelessly or who took their pay and gave nothing in return, would find his household dissolving around him. The best commanders understood this. They knew that their power rested on the quality of the relationship they had built with their personal forces. There was also the Confucian framework that shaped Ming military culture. The values of loyalty to one's superiors, filial piety toward one's parents and ancestors, the obligation to serve the state and the emperor, these were not empty abstractions in a military family. They were lived realities, taught by example, reinforced by the fact that the family's reputation and future depended on maintaining a record of honorable service. A border general family that produced cowards or deserters lost everything. Their rank, their land, their social standing, their ability to recruit and maintain the household forces that were the foundation of their power. The pressure to perform was not just personal, it was dynastic. It fell on sons and grandsons who had never chosen the military life but had been born into its obligations. This was the world that produced the soldiers who would cross the sea to fight in Korea, who would face the warriors that Japan had been refining for 6 centuries, who would stand on Korean battlefields against men who had never been defeated by a foreign army on their own terms. The collision was coming, and when it came, it would produce some of the most brutal and consequential fighting in the history of East Asia. That battle begins in the next chapter. Chapter 6. The Korean Crucible. Ming generals against Japanese warriors. In the summer of 1592, the Japanese army that had just taken Seoul sent a message north. It was not a diplomatic message, it was a military signal. The message was the speed of the advance itself. Korea's capital had fallen in less than 3 weeks after the Japanese landing at Busan. 3 weeks to cover the length of a peninsula that military planners had assumed would take months to fight through. The Korean army had collapsed so completely that there were barely enough survivors to carry the news to the Ming court in Beijing. The Ming emperor read the reports and understood immediately what they meant. If Japan could take Korea, Japan was on the border of China. The buffer state that had existed between the Ming Empire and the sea was gone. And the army that had just demonstrated it could destroy a Korean force in weeks was now sitting on the Yalu River, 1 step from Chinese territory. The Ming response was not a diplomatic protest. It was an army. What followed was one of the largest military interventions in East Asian history, and it produced something that rarely happens in the historical record. A direct, sustained, large-scale confrontation between 2 of the great warrior traditions of the medieval world. Ming border generals and their household troops, veterans of decades of frontier warfare against Mongol cavalry, going head-to-head against Japanese samurai, the most intensely trained individual warriors in the world. The result was not what either side expected. Part 1. The warrior who remade Japanese war. To understand what the Ming generals were walking into, you need to understand what had happened to the Japanese military in the century before the Korean invasion. Because the samurai who landed at Busan in 1592 were not the same warriors who had faced the Mongols 3 centuries earlier. They had been transformed by a century of continuous civil war, and by one man above all others. But Tam. Oda Nobunaga had looked at the Japanese military tradition and seen its weakness with brutal clarity. Individual warrior excellence was magnificent. It was also in large formations against disciplined opponents, suicidal. The solution he implemented at the Battle of Nagashino in 1575 was as simple as it was revolutionary. He took 3,000 men armed with matchlock muskets, organized them into rotating firing lines behind wooden palisades, and let the famous Takeda cavalry charge into continuous fire. The Takeda cavalry was arguably the finest in Japan. It ceased to exist as a fighting force in less than an afternoon. After Nagashino, every serious military commander in Japan understood that the age of individual cavalry combat was over. The wars that followed, and there were many, were fought by large armies of disciplined infantry, armed with a combination of spears, swords, and increasingly with firearms. The samurai did not disappear, but he became one element of a combined arms force rather than the decisive element. By 1592, the Japanese army that crossed to Korea was a genuinely formidable modern military force. Its core was still samurai officers and warriors who retained the individual fighting skills of their tradition. But those samurai commanded large formations of trained infantry ashigaru, foot soldiers whose discipline and firearm proficiency had been hammered into them by decades of Sengoku warfare. The Japanese army that took Korea so quickly was not a band of honorable individual warriors. It was a modern professional military force that happened to be led by men with 7 centuries of warrior tradition behind them, and it was commanded by some of the most capable military minds Japan had ever produced. Part 2. The Battle of Pyongyang. The first Ming intervention force arrived in Korea in the winter of 1592. It was not large. Perhaps 5,000 men under a general named Zhu Chengshun, sent quickly to assess the situation, and if possible, push the Japanese back before they could consolidate their gains. Zhu Chengshun badly underestimated his opponent. He launched a cavalry assault on the Japanese position at Pyongyang without adequate reconnaissance or preparation, assuming that a Chinese force would have an inherent advantage over Japanese warriors. His cavalry was repulsed with serious losses. He retreated. The first Ming intervention had been a failure, but the Ming response to failure was not paralysis, it was escalation. A larger force was assembled and sent south under the command of Li Rusong, son of the famous Li Chengliang, inheritor of the Liaodong military tradition that his father had built over decades. Li Rusong was everything his father's household military system was designed to produce, an experienced frontier commander who had spent his career fighting Mongol cavalry on the northern border, a man who understood mobile warfare, who knew how to use terrain, who had the confidence that comes from years of successful command. He brought with him not just soldiers but artillery, heavy cannon, positioned to bombard fortified positions with a weight of fire that Japanese defensive works had not been designed to withstand. In January of 1593, the Ming force launched its assault on Pyongyang. The battle was a masterpiece of combined arms coordination. Artillery bombardment shattered the Japanese defensive positions and killed defenders before the infantry assault even began. Multiple columns attacked simultaneously from different directions, preventing the Japanese garrison from concentrating its defense at any single point. Korean Allied forces cut off escape routes to the south. The Japanese garrison at Pyongyang, commanded by Konishi Yukinaga, fought with genuine ferocity. But fighting ferocity against well-directed cannon fire from positions you cannot reach is not a formula for survival. The garrison broke and retreated south, abandoning the city, leaving their dead behind. Li Rusong had retaken Pyongyang in a single day. The Ming intervention had begun in earnest. Part 3. The ambush at Byok-Jegwan. Success at Pyongyang created a problem that Li Rusong did not fully account for. Victory made him confident. Confidence made him aggressive. Aggressiveness, without adequate intelligence about what lay ahead, made him vulnerable. Pursuing the retreating Japanese south towards Seoul, Li Rusong rode ahead of his main force with a cavalry vanguard of perhaps a few thousand men. He was operating on the assumption that the Japanese were in full retreat, that the fall of Pyongyang had broken their will to resist, that a rapid pursuit would turn a tactical victory into a strategic triumph. He was wrong. The Japanese had not broken. They had retreated to prepared positions and were waiting. At a place called Byok-Jegwan, a narrow valley north of Seoul, a large Japanese force under multiple commanders had set up exactly the kind of ambush that the terrain favoured. When Li Rusong's cavalry vanguard rode into the valley, they found themselves surrounded by Japanese infantry and samurai warriors on the high ground on both sides. What followed was one of the most intense small unit engagements of the entire Korean War. Li Rusong's cavalry was outnumbered and in terrible terrain for mounted combat. The Japanese fire from the high ground was devastating. Li Rusong himself had horses killed under him and was nearly captured or killed multiple times. The fighting was close, brutal, and lasted for hours. The Ming cavalry did not break. This is the remarkable part. Outnumbered, ambushed, in terrible terrain, fighting against some of the most capable individual warriors in the world, the Liaodong frontier veterans held. They fought their way to defensible ground. They held their position until reinforcements from the main Ming force arrived, and the Japanese withdrew rather than risk a general engagement against the full army. Baekjeguan was not a Ming victory. It was also not the catastrophic defeat that it could easily have been. It was a brutal test of what frontier-hardened Chinese soldiers could do against Japanese warriors at their best. And the answer was that they could survive, and hold, and fight back, even under conditions that should have destroyed them. Li Rusong learned from the ambush. He became more cautious in his advance, more careful with his intelligence before committing his cavalry. The war settled into a long stalemate, with the Ming and Korean forces holding the north and the Japanese holding the south of the peninsula. Part 4. Wanli's Korea, the second round. The negotiations that followed the first phase of fighting lasted for years and produced nothing. The gap between what the Japanese demanded, territory, trade rights, formal recognition, and what the Ming were willing to concede, which was essentially nothing of substance, was simply too large to bridge. In 1597, Toyotomi Hideyoshi launched the second invasion, and this time the Ming were ready. The second phase of the Korean War was different from the first, in important ways. Korean resistance was more organized. The righteous armies, guerrilla forces of ordinary Koreans who had spent 5 years learning how to fight the Japanese occupiers, were a constant drain on Japanese resources and manpower. The Japanese could hold their fortified positions along the southern coast, but could not advance north without exposing their supply lines to constant harassment. And the Ming intervention force in the second phase was larger, better organized, and commanded with more sophistication than in the first. The Battle of Sachon in 1598 illustrated both the capabilities and the limitations of the Ming military in this conflict. A Ming force assaulted a fortified Japanese position held by the samurai commander Shimazu Yoshihiro. The initial assault made progress. Then a powder magazine inside the fortress exploded, killing significant numbers of Ming attackers and creating chaos in the assault force. Shimazu counterattacked with the aggression and tactical skill that had made him one of the most feared commanders in Japan. The Ming force took serious losses and withdrew. But Sachon did not decide the war. What decided the war was not any single battle. It was the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1598 and the immediate decision by the council governing Japan to withdraw the army from Korea. The second invasion ended not with a military decision, but with a political one. The withdrawal itself became one final chapter of the fighting. At the Battle of Noryang, a combined Ming and Korean naval force intercepted the Japanese fleet, attempting to evacuate the army from the Korean coast. The engagement was ferocious. The Japanese lost dozens of ships. Yi Sun-sin, the Korean admiral who had been the most effective naval commander of the entire war, was killed by a musket ball in the final moments of the battle. The Japanese army evacuated successfully, but at a cost. Part 5. What the war actually proved. The Korean War of 1592 to 1598 was one of the largest conflicts of the 16th century. It involved the three major military powers of East Asia, produced hundreds of thousands of casualties, and reshaped the political landscape of the region for generations. What did it prove about the relative quality of Ming border soldiers and Japanese samurai? The honest answer is that it proved they were closely matched. Neither side could deliver a knockout blow against the other in sustained combat. The Japanese army, despite its remarkable initial advance, could not hold Korea against determined Ming and Korean resistance. The Ming army, despite its superior artillery and its ability to sustain losses that would have crippled a smaller force, could not drive the Japanese into the sea. In individual combat, the evidence suggests that the samurai were formidable opponents for the Ming frontier soldiers. At Baekjeguan, against all the odds, Japanese warriors had nearly destroyed one of the best cavalry forces in Asia. In the siege fighting that dominated the later stages of the war, Japanese samurai defending prepared positions made the cost of assault almost prohibitive. But the Ming military system had advantages that individual warrior excellence could not overcome. The ability to absorb losses and replace them, the artillery firepower that could reduce Japanese fortifications to rubble, the logistical system that could sustain an army in the field for years, the coordination between multiple arms, cavalry, infantry, and artillery that the Japanese army, for all its individual excellence, could not always match. In the end, neither the samurai nor the Ming border soldier was the greatest fighter in any absolute sense. They were different kinds of excellence, optimized for different kinds of warfare, meeting on a battlefield that rewarded different qualities at different moments. The war in Korea was a draw, an enormously expensive, enormously bloody draw, and while it was being fought, the forces that would eventually end both the samurai tradition and the Ming dynasty were already gathering. In the northeast, a Jurchen chieftain named Nuhasi was quietly unifying the tribes that would one day become the Qing dynasty. In Japan, the end of the Korean War would trigger the political crisis that led to Sekigahara and the Tokugawa peace that would ultimately make the samurai obsolete. History was moving, and both warrior traditions, remarkable as they were about to be overtaken by it. Chapter 7. The Last Campaigns. 4 warriors meet their endings. Every warrior tradition ends, not always in battle, not always in defeat, sometimes in something quieter and more final than either. Sometimes in the simple fact that the world changes faster than the warrior can change with it. The European knight, the Mongol companion warrior, the Japanese samurai, the Ming border general. 4 traditions that had defined military excellence in their respective worlds for centuries. 4 systems that had produced remarkable fighters, remarkable cultures, and remarkable victories. All 4 of them were gone by the middle of the 19th century. All 4 of them were destroyed by versions of the same force. Not a better warrior, not a more honourable code, but technology, and the political systems that technology made possible. The endings were different in their details, similar in their logic, and in each case, the ending reveals something essential about what the tradition had always been, beneath the mythology and the romance, and the stories that each culture told about its own warriors. Part 1. The knight meets the gun. The European knight did not die at a single moment. He faded. Over the course of roughly 2 centuries, from the mid-14th to the mid-16th century, the military system that had made the mounted armoured warrior the decisive force on the battlefield was gradually made obsolete by a combination of changes that individually might have been manageable, but together were irresistible. The first change was the longbow. English archers at Crecy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415 demonstrated that disciplined infantry with ranged weapons could stop a cavalry charge before it reached the line. The knights who rode into those arrow storms died by the thousands. The tactical invincibility of the heavy cavalry charge had been broken, but even after Crecy, the knight did not disappear. The longbow required years of training to use effectively. The physical demands of drawing an English warbow repeatedly in battle were enormous, and England's supply of trained archers was not infinite. The Swiss pikemen, who became the dominant infantry force of the 15th century, were more durable as a solution. A pike square, men standing shoulder to shoulder with 5 to 6 metre pikes lowered against cavalry, simply could not be ridden down. The horse would not charge into a wall of steel points. The cavalry charge that had defined European warfare for 5 centuries had no answer to disciplined infantry that refused to break. And then came gunpowder. The early firearms of the 14th and 15th centuries were primitive, unreliable, and slow. They required extensive logistical support and elaborate preparation to use. But they had one quality that outweighed all their disadvantages. They could kill an armoured man. An arrow might glance off plate armour. A pike might be deflected by a shield. A lead ball fired from a musket at close range went through armour as if it were not there. The response of the military establishment was to make the armour heavier. Plate armour of the 15th and 16th centuries was genuinely remarkable engineering, shaped and tempered to deflect blows, articulated to allow movement, fitted so precisely to the individual wearer that it distributed its weight across the whole body rather than concentrating it at a few pressure points. A man in good quality full plate armour could run, jump, climb a ladder and fight effectively. But heavier armour meant slower horses carrying greater weight. and slower cavalry against musket fire was more vulnerable, not less. The armour race was one the knight could not win. By the mid-16th century, the most practical response to firearms was not more armour but less. Light cavalry that could move fast enough to close the distance before reloading was complete, or stay far enough away that accuracy was limited. The heavily armoured knight was becoming an expensive anachronism. The 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648, the last great conflict of the European religious wars, was fought by armies, in which the cavalry played a very different role from the medieval ideal. Cavalry still mattered, but the decisive arm was infantry with firearms. The knight, as a distinct military and social class, had effectively ceased to exist. What remained was the aristocratic officer, leading professional soldiers in armies funded and organised by centralised states that had no need for the feudal military obligation that had created the knight in the first place. The institution that had given birth to the knight, the decentralised feudal system where military power was distributed among thousands of landholding warriors, had been replaced by the centralised nation-state. And the nation-state had no use for warriors who owned their own equipment and owed service according to ancient custom. It needed soldiers who obeyed orders, followed regulations, and could be replaced when they were killed. The knight's independence, which had been his strength within the feudal system, was a liability in a professional army. The last knights did not fall in battle. They became cavalry officers, or country gentlemen, or politicians. Their armour went into castle halls as decoration. Their titles survived long after the military function that had justified those titles was gone. Part 2. The Mongol warriors' long decline. The Mongol companion warriors outlasted the empire that created them, but only by adapting into something quite different from what they had been under Genghis Khan and his successors. After the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire in the mid-13th century, the various successor states went their separate ways. The Golden Horde in Russia eventually converted to Islam and was absorbed into the complex of successor states that eventually produced the Russian Empire. The Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East similarly converted to Islam and dissolved into the regional political landscape. In China, the Yuan dynasty fell to the Ming in 1368. The Mongols retreated to the steppe, and on the steppe they continued. For centuries, the Ming dynasty spent enormous resources trying to contain the Mongol threat. The northern border was the Ming Empire's permanent preoccupation, the drain that consumed military budgets and frontier garrisons generation after generation. The Mongol successor states, fragmented and often fighting each other, could never again threaten China with conquest, but they could raid. They could appear suddenly, destroy what they could reach, and disappear before any response could be organised. They remained, on the individual level, some of the most capable cavalry fighters in the world. What they could not do was adapt. The steppe economy that had produced the Mongol warrior was self-contained and self-reinforcing. The same way of life that created exceptional horsemen also prevented the development of the agricultural surplus, the urban centres, the specialised crafts, and the accumulated capital that were the foundations of the gunpowder revolution. The Mongol successor states could acquire firearms through trade or capture. They could not manufacture them. They could not maintain a sustainable supply of powder and shot independent of external sources. They could not develop the logistical systems that made firearm-equipped armies effective over sustained campaigns. The Ming border generals who faced the Mongols from the 15th century onward were increasingly armed with firearms while their opponents were not. The tactical advantage that Mongol cavalry had always held, speed, manoeuvrability, the ability to strike and withdraw before the enemy could concentrate, was being eroded by the simple fact that a musket ball travelled faster than a horse. The final chapter of the Mongol warrior tradition was written not by the Ming but by the Qing dynasty. The Manchu rulers who replaced the Ming in 1644 were themselves products of the northeastern frontier, superb cavalry fighters who understood the steppe military tradition from the inside. They defeated the Mongol successor states not just militarily but politically, binding the Mongol nobility into the Qing system through marriage alliances, the banner system, and the strategic use of Tibetan Buddhism as a shared cultural framework that gave the Mongol aristocracy a reason to cooperate with Manchu rule. By the 18th century, the great Mongol military tradition was finished as an independent force. The individual skills persisted. Mongol horsemen serving in Qing banner armies remained formidable, But the independent warrior culture that had terrified Europe and nearly conquered Japan was gone, absorbed into a larger imperial system that had learned to contain it. Part 3. The Samurai's Gilded Cage. The samurai survived the Mongol invasions. They survived the century of civil war that produced Nobunaga and Hideyoshi and Ieyasu. They survived the Korean War. What destroyed them was peace. The Tokugawa peace that settled over Japan after Sekigahara in 1600 was, by any historical standard, a remarkable achievement. 2.5 centuries of internal stability in a country that had known almost continuous warfare for 150 years before. No major internal conflict. No foreign invasion. A sophisticated economy, a flourishing culture, and a population that grew steadily throughout the period. For the samurai class, it was a slow catastrophe. A warrior with no war to fight is not a warrior. He is a man with a sword who has forgotten what swords are for. The Tokugawa government, understanding that idle samurai with military skills and a tradition of autonomous action were a potential source of instability, deliberately channeled the samurai class into administrative roles, ritual functions, and the endless cultivation of forms. The sword became a symbol rather than a weapon. The martial arts became arts, refined and codified and increasingly divorced from their military purpose. The stipend system that paid the samurai was based on rice assessments that had been fixed in the early Tokugawa period and never adjusted. As the Japanese economy became more commercial and prices rose, the real value of samurai stipends fell. Many samurai families slipped into poverty while maintaining the outward appearances of their status, a combination of rigid social obligation and declining economic resources that produced profound internal tensions. When the Black Ships arrived in 1853 and forced Japan to confront the reality of Western military power, the samurai class faced a crisis that had no good solution. The individual martial skills they had spent lifetimes cultivating were irrelevant against cannon and rifles. The political system they embodied was the obstacle to the reforms that Japan needed to survive as an independent nation. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 abolished the political foundations of the samurai system. The stipends were ended. The right to carry swords in public was revoked in 1876. The samurai class was legally dissolved. Men whose families had been warriors for 20 generations became citizens, equal before the law to the farmers and merchants that the old system had placed below them. Some adapted brilliantly. The skills that made samurai effective, discipline, literacy, organizational capacity, the ability to command and to follow, proved enormously valuable in the bureaucracies and armies of the new Japan. Many of the Meiji era's most capable officials and military officers came from samurai families. They took the warrior tradition and redirected its energy into building a modern state. But the tradition itself, the specific form of warrior culture that the samurai had embodied, was finished. Saigo Takamori's rebellion in 1877, the last armed resistance of the samurai class, was crushed by the Meiji conscript army in a few months. Ordinary men, farmers' sons mostly, armed with modern rifles and organized by Western military doctrine, defeated the finest samurai warriors alive. The message was unmistakable. The age of the individual warrior was over. Part 4. The border generals fade away. The Ming border generals lasted as long as the Ming dynasty. When the dynasty fell, they fell with it. But the manner of their ending reveals something important about both their strengths and their limitations. The Ming dynasty collapsed from multiple directions simultaneously. Internal rebellion, driven by the economic distress of the peasantry, produced the massive uprising that would eventually put the rebel leader Li Zicheng in Beijing and drive the last Ming emperor to hang himself on a hill behind the Forbidden City. External pressure from the Jurchen state that Nuhasi had built in the northeast, and that his successors would lead into China as the Qing dynasty, provided a second mortal threat that the weakened Ming state could not address while fighting internal revolt. The border generals and their household troops were the Ming dynasty's last military asset worth mentioning. The regular Waisuo forces had long since become useless. The border generals Jiading were the only troops that could actually fight. And they fought, in the last decades of the Ming, with a ferocity and a commitment that the dynasty they served had long since ceased to deserve. Men like Yuan Chonghuan, who held the northeastern frontier against the Qing for years with forces that were chronically undersupplied and underpaid, represents the best of what the border general tradition had produced. He was brilliant, aggressive, and entirely loyal to an emperor who had him executed on false charges of treason in 1630, removing the one commander who might have been able to hold the northeast indefinitely. The tragedy of the Ming border generals in the final decades is not that they failed. Given what they were working with, holding together at all was an achievement. The tragedy is that the system that produced them, the hereditary military families, the household troop loyalty, the accumulated knowledge of specific frontier terrain and specific enemies, was itself a product of the Ming political structure. When that structure collapsed, the system that had sustained the border generals for 2 centuries collapsed with it. Some of the great military families survived by changing sides. Wu Sangui, one of the last great commanders of Ming border forces, opened the gates of the Shanhai Pass to the Qing armies in 1644, allowing them to enter China proper. His reasons were complex, but the result was clear. The Qing rewarded useful Ming military talent with positions in the new order. Many border general families found themselves serving a new dynasty with the same professional competence they had brought to the old one. The institution itself did not survive. The Qing military system, the banner armies that were the Manchu equivalent of the Ming household troops, had no place for an independent class of Han Chinese military families with their own soldiers and their own traditions. The border generals were absorbed, domesticated, or eliminated. Their descendants became Qing officials or private citizens. The accumulated military wisdom of generations of frontier fighting was lost within a generation. 4 warrior traditions, 4 different endings, all of them pointing toward the same conclusion. 2. The age of the feudal warrior was over everywhere, finished by the combination of firearms technology and centralized state power that made individual martial excellence irrelevant to the outcomes of battles. What they left behind was not just history, it was a question. A question about what warriors are for, when the world no longer needs warriors in the old sense. And that question, it turns out, is still being answered. Chapter 8. The Verdict. Who was the greatest warrior? You have been waiting for this answer since the beginning. 4 warrior traditions, centuries of fighting, direct confrontations on real battlefields where the question of who was better was answered not by historians but by the men who were there, with their lives as the stakes. The European knight, the Mongol companion warrior, the Japanese samurai, the Ming border general. Who was the greatest? The tempting answer is to look at the scoreboard. The Mongols defeated the knights at Legnica and Mohi. The Ming defeated the samurai in Korea. 2. Therefore the Mongols were better than the knights, and the Ming were better than the samurai. And if we could somehow arrange a final tournament between Mongol and Ming, we would have our champion. But that answer is wrong. Not because the battles did not happen, or because the results were different from what the record shows. The battles happened, and the results were what they were. The answer is wrong because it mistakes the outcome of specific historical encounters for a timeless verdict about the quality of the warriors involved. And once you understand why that distinction matters, you understand something important not just about these 4 warrior traditions, but about the nature of military excellence itself. Part 1. What the battles actually proved. Start with the Mongols against the knights. At Legnica and Mohi in 1241, the Mongol army destroyed the finest military forces that Central Europe could field. This is not disputed. It happened. The question is what it means. The Mongol military system was genuinely superior to the European knightly system for the specific kind of warfare the Mongols practiced. Mobile cavalry warfare on open terrain, using speed, coordination, and the feigned retreat to destroy enemies who could not match their maneuverability. Against an opponent who fought the way European knights fought, the Mongol system won consistently. But notice what this does not prove. It does not prove that a Mongol warrior was a better individual fighter than a European knight. It proves that the Mongol military system was better optimized for open field warfare against the specific tactical approach of European heavy cavalry. Different terrain, different circumstances, different tactical problem. The result might have been different. The Crusades provide an interesting data point here. In the Middle East, European knights fighting in terrain that partially neutralized the Mongol cavalry advantages, behind fortified walls and in mountain passes where maneuver was limited, performed significantly better against Mongol forces than their counterparts had on the Polish plain. The Mamluk armies of Egypt, which were themselves former steppe cavalry warriors fighting in a style similar to the Mongols, defeated Mongol forces at Ain Jalut in 1260, the first significant Mongol defeat in the field. Military excellence is always contextual. Now look at the Ming against the samurai. The Korean War did not produce a clean verdict. The Ming retook Pyongyang. The Japanese nearly destroyed the Ming cavalry at Bayokjiguan. The Ming held their ground in the long stalemate. The Japanese held their coastal fortresses against Ming assaults that should have overwhelmed them. By the time Hideyoshi died and the Japanese withdrew, neither side had achieved decisive military superiority over the other. The honest assessment of Ming border soldiers versus Japanese samurai is that they were closely matched in ways that prevented either side from achieving the kind of clear dominance that the Mongols had shown against the knights. The Ming had advantages in artillery, logistics, and the ability to absorb losses. The Japanese had advantages in individual fighting quality, tactical flexibility at the unit level, and the ability to defend prepared positions with extraordinary tenacity. The war was decided by politics, by Hideyoshi's death, not by any battlefield verdict. Part 2. The question beneath the question. Here is what the comparison of these four warrior traditions is really about. Not who could beat whom in a hypothetical tournament, but what conditions allow a warrior culture to develop, flourish, and eventually be remembered as representing something genuinely excellent about human capability. The scholars who have compared European knights and Japanese samurai across centuries have noticed something that goes beyond military tactics. Both traditions produce not just effective warriors but elaborate cultures organized around the warrior's role, chivalry, and bushido. Both codes demanded courage, loyalty, the acceptance of death, and a certain style of behavior that went beyond simple military function. Both traditions produced literature, art, and philosophy that explored what it meant to live as a warrior. Both became the basis for cultural identities that lasted long after the military function that created them had become obsolete. The Mongol companion warrior and the Ming border general produced less of this cultural elaboration. The Mongol tradition was more purely military, less invested in the kind of ritual and ceremony and philosophical reflection that surrounded both the knight and the samurai. The Ming border general tradition was embedded in a Confucian framework that valued military service, but did not elevate it to the kind of spiritual calling that Bushido represented for the samurai. Does this make the knights and samurai better warriors? Not necessarily. It makes them more memorable ones, more mythologized ones. The cultural production that surrounded both traditions ensured that they would be studied, admired, and romanticized long after they were gone in a way that the Mongol companion and the Ming border general have not been. And this brings us to the uncomfortable truth that lies at the heart of the comparison. Part 3. Why some warriors are remembered and others are not. The European knight and the Japanese samurai are remembered as the great warrior traditions of the medieval world. The Mongol companion defeated the knight. Ming border soldiers matched the samurai. But it is the knight and the samurai whose names appear on the covers of books, whose images fill museum halls, whose traditions inspire films and novels and video games 600 years after their military function ended. Why? The answer has almost nothing to do with military excellence. It has everything to do with what happened to the civilizations that produced these warriors. Western Europe was never conquered by an outside power after the fall of Rome. Its feudal system evolved from within, producing the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and eventually the Industrial Revolution. The cultural continuity of Western European civilization meant that its warrior tradition could be studied, celebrated, and mythologized by descendants who were proud of it. Japan was never conquered by a foreign power in its entire pre-modern history. The Mongol invasions failed. The American pressure that opened Japan in 1853 was humiliating but not conquest. Japan's transition to modernity, while forced by external pressure, was accomplished on Japanese terms by Japanese people. The samurai tradition could be claimed by modern Japan as part of a continuous national heritage. The Mongol Empire, by contrast, fragmented and was absorbed by the civilizations it had conquered. The steppe culture that produced the companion warrior system was marginalized by agricultural and industrial civilization. The inheritors of the Mongol tradition, the modern peoples of Mongolia and Central Asia, spent centuries under foreign rule before achieving independence in the 20th century. There was no powerful modern civilization to celebrate and mythologize the Mongol warrior. The Ming dynasty was destroyed by foreign conquest. The Qing dynasty that replaced it deliberately suppressed Chinese military traditions that it saw as potential threats. The border general families were dissolved and their traditions forgotten. Modern China's relationship with its Ming military heritage is complex, filtered through the Qing period and the upheavals of the 19th and 20th centuries. This is the real answer to the question of who was the greatest warrior. The question itself is shaped by the survival and cultural power of the civilizations that produced the warriors being compared. The knight and the samurai appear greatest partly because the civilizations they came from survived and had the power to tell their own stories. The Mongol warrior and the Ming border general appear lesser partly because the civilizations they came from were disrupted and did not have the same opportunity. Part 4. What each tradition actually got right. Strip away the mythology and the cultural bias and look at what each tradition actually contributed to the history of human warfare. What did each of them get right? The European knight got the institution right. The feudal system, for all its inefficiencies and injustices, created a self-sustaining military class that could maintain its capabilities across generations without continuous state support. The knight's equipment was his skills were his. The system did not depend on a central government remaining competent enough to fund and organize a professional army. This resilience made it durable in a way that centralized military systems often were not. The Mongol companion warrior got the system right. The decimal organization, the meritocratic promotion, the intelligence-driven operational planning, the strategic patience that allowed campaigns to be designed across multiple years and thousands of kilometers. The Mongol military system was the most sophisticated operational war-fighting machine the world had seen to that point. Its insights about mobility, coordination, and the importance of information about the enemy are still studied in military academies. The Japanese samurai got the individual right. The depth of physical and mental training, the cultivation of martial skills to a level of excellence that was genuinely beyond anything comparable, the philosophical framework that gave the warrior's life meaning beyond simple employment. The samurai tradition produced individual fighters whose capabilities have rarely been equaled in the history of hand-to-hand combat. The Ming border general got the relationship right. The loyalty between commander and household troops, built through shared hardship and mutual obligation, produced a military effectiveness that neither conscription nor pure professionalism could reliably generate. The understanding that soldiers fight best for men they know and trust, rather than for abstractions like nation or duty, is a military truth that the border general tradition embodied more completely than almost any other. 4 different answers to the problem of how to make effective warriors. 4 different things done well. 4 different things that ultimately could not survive the transformation of warfare that gunpowder technology and centralized state power brought about. Part 5. Do not judge by victory alone. The book that gave us this comparison ends with a phrase that deserves to be heard in full. Do not judge heroes by their victories alone. It is easy to say, it is harder to actually mean it. History is written by winners, and the losers of history have always struggled to have their excellence recognized alongside their defeat. The Mongol companions who rode across the steppe and shook the world were remarkable human beings, whatever became of the empire they built. The Ming border generals who held the northern frontier for 2 centuries, who sent their sons to die in the same border soil where their fathers had died, who maintained their professional excellence in the face of a political system that consistently failed to support them, deserve to be remembered as the serious warriors they were. And the knight and the samurai, for all the mythology that surrounds them, were also real. Not the perfect heroes of romance and legend, but actual human beings who chose a hard life for the sake of an ideal, who trained from childhood in skills that demanded everything they had, and who found in the warrior's vocation something that gave their lives meaning. None of them were the greatest. All of them were remarkable. The question of who was the greatest warrior tradition of the medieval world has no clean answer, because it is the wrong question. The right question is what each tradition reveals about what human beings are capable of when they commit themselves completely to a single demanding vocation. And the answer to that question, across all 4 traditions, is the same. More than you might think. Much more than is comfortable to contemplate. The swords are gone. The stirrups and the composite bows and the matchlock muskets that replaced them are in museums. The feudal systems that produced these warriors are centuries in the past. But the human qualities that made these warriors remarkable, the courage, the discipline, the loyalty, the willingness to accept death as the price of commitment to something larger than individual survival, These qualities are not gone. They have simply found new forms, new contexts, new expressions in a world that no longer needs men on horseback with swords. Whether those new forms are adequate replacements for what was lost is a question that each generation has to answer for itself. The warriors are finished. The questions they raised are not,